What's up everyone? Coach Tony from Bonvec Strength, and today I'm going to talk about a topic that gets brought up to me every once in a while, not too often, but every once in a while I encounter somebody who tells me that they're not interested in lifting heavy, they're not interested in getting really strong in the barbell lifts. All they really care about is how they look, or aesthetics as the kids say these days. Now that usually means one of two things: either that they're interested in getting bigger, so hypertrophy, bigger muscles, or they're interested in getting leaner, so decreasing their body fat so they can kind of show off the muscle that they've built. Now, in either of these situations, I think it's still important to lift relatively heavy, and I'm gonna explain why. It's not just my bias as a power lifter, and that's the people who I train, but it is actually physiologically important to include some sort of heavy training for either of those more physique-based goals. Now let's talk about the first one, getting bigger muscles, hypertrophy training. Now, hypertrophy training tends to work best when you're in that kind of like 8 to 20 rep range, higher reps, so to speak, especially if you're used to powerlifting, where the closer you are to 1 rep, the more specific you are to your sport. Now, the thing is that muscles don't react like light switches to rep ranges. It's not like, okay, I'm only training for maximal strength if I'm doing 1 to 3 reps. Okay, I'm only training for general strength if I'm training from 3 to 8 reps, and hypertrophy only occurs if I go 8 reps and above. Muscular endurance only happens at 20 reps and above. That's just not true. It's kind of a sliding scale, almost like a dimmer switch. So you're not just like turning off one stimulus and turning on another as soon as you get to those different rep ranges. All those physical qualities are trained to some degree along that entire continuum, just less so the further you get away from that specific rep range. So if I'm only doing very, very heavy low rep training, say like 3 reps or lower, the muscular endurance component is going to be negligible. You might get a little bit of hypertrophy, but it's not nothing. And on the contrary, if I'm only training in that hypertrophy rep range or in that muscular endurance standpoint, the effect on maximal strength is going to be very negligible, but again, not nothing. So if you're training in that lower rep range with heavier weights, there is going to be some sort of hypertrophy stimulus, and the main reason for that is still the #1 driver of hypertrophy is mechanical tension. And what that means is just muscles straining under heavy weights. So a lot of times what we think of hypertrophy training, that high rep training, getting a big pump, getting a lot of muscle in the localized area that we're training, we call that metabolic stress. Your body does create a situation for hypertrophy. It does send signals to the muscles. It does create the hormonal environment to trigger muscle growth, but that's only one part of it. You're definitely going to get the most robust hypertrophy stimulus, especially earlier on in your training career, with a decent amount of heavy lifting. So I think it's a good idea for people who want to build muscle to still include a decent amount of training, probably more in like the 3 to 8 rep range, relatively heavy. If we're talking RPE, things in like the 8, 9 RPE range, and that I think is going to have a pronounced effect on hypertrophy. Completely removing that from your training and only focusing on higher rep, lower load training, I think is a big mistake. You're missing a big chunk of training that could be helping you get bigger. Now, the other situation that we talked about, people who want to get leaner, people who want to shed body fat to get their physique closer to what they're looking for, heavy training gives your body a reason to hang on to lean mass when you're in a caloric deficit. Basically, if you're trying to lean out, you're going to be eating less than you normally would. Fewer calories means less energy to fuel your training, and a lot of times people get to those leanest levels, like bodybuilding stage ready, by drastically reducing the amount of carbohydrates you're taking in, and carbs are the preferential fuel for intense exercise. So if you're not consuming a lot of calories, and especially if you're not consuming a lot of carbs, there's not a lot of energy for all that high volume training. A big mistake that a lot of people make when they try to lean out is they get rid of all the heavy lifting and they just do a ton of work, a ton of sets, a ton of reps per set, limit those rest periods. That's probably the exact opposite what you want to do. You want to give your body a reason to hang on to the lean mass that you have, so as you lean out, you're not losing that muscle tissue. And a really effective way to do that is to still include some heavy lifting in there. Now you're much more likely to be able to effectively perform a couple of heavy low rep sets that are more kind of neurologically dependent, because remember, the heavier lifting that you do, the more neurologically driven that it is. It's more skill dependent, not so much based on kind of like the physiology of like how much glycogen can your muscles hold on to, how effective is your cardiac system and your respiratory system, which is a little bit more dependent on those higher rep training protocols. So if you are trying to diet down, don't get rid of all that heavy training. Don't do a lot of it, but just a little bit of that heavier strength training can give your body the stimulus it needs to not shed the hard-earned muscle that you've built while you're dieting down. So as you can see, even if your goals are strictly physique-based and you have no aspirations to become a world champion powerlifter, you're not interested in testing 1 rep maxes, you should still include some heavy training in your lifting, because it's gonna help you take that step closer to achieving those physique goals that you're after.